There is a moment that reveals everything about power. It happens in the space between words, in the pause after an accusation, in the stillness that follows a demand. Someone speaks. They expect response. They wait for your defense, your explanation, your justification, and you give them nothing, just silence. Just the calm, unreadable quiet of someone who has chosen not to participate. Watch what happens in that moment. Watch the shift in their eyes, the confusion, the frustration, the dawning recognition that their power was always dependent on your compliance, that their words only had weight because you agreed to carry them, that their judgment only mattered because you granted it authority. Your silence removes that authority, strips away the pretense, reveals the performance as performance, and in that revelation, something dark and fascinating emerges. The psychology beneath the social mask, the manipulation beneath the conversation, the control mechanism beneath the relationship. The ancient Stoics understood this darkness with disturbing precision. They lived in a world of naked power, of emperors who could execute on whim, of social structures maintained through fear and spectacle, of manipulation so sophisticated it passed as civilization. And they discovered something that terrified their oppressors. Silence is not passive. Silence is surgical. It exposes the mechanics of control by refusing to participate in them. It reveals manipulation by declining to be manipulated. It demonstrates that power is a performance that requires an audience, and without audience reaction, the performance collapses into absurdity. But more than this, they understood that silence operates on psychological levels most people never see, that it triggers specific fears, that it exploits particular vulnerabilities, that it weaponizes the human need for validation and response. This is the dark psychology of silence, not the comfortable idea that quiet is peaceful, but the uncomfortable truth that strategic silence is one of the most psychologically destabilizing forces available to human beings. Because humans are meaning-making machines, we cannot tolerate ambiguity. We fill silence with interpretation. And when someone deliberately withholds response, withholds explanation, withholds the social signals we've been conditioned to expect, our minds go into overdrive trying to fill the void. We create narratives, we project intentions, we imagine judgments, and almost always, we imagine the worst. This is not paranoia. This is the negativity bias that evolution wired into human neurology. When faced with ambiguity, assume threat. When confronted with uncertainty, predict danger. This kept your ancestors alive, but it also makes you psychologically vulnerable to someone who understands how to deploy silence strategically, because they can trigger your threat detection system without saying a word, can make you feel judged without issuing judgment, can make you feel small without criticism, can control your emotional state without visible action, just by being silent, just by withholding the response you've been trained to expect. This is the darkness the Stoics map, the shadow side of human psychology, the mechanisms of fear and control that operate beneath conscious awareness. Let's examine this darkness systematically. Let's look at what actually happens in the human mind when confronted with deliberate silence. Because this is not comfortable territory. This is the recognition that silence can be weaponized, that the same tool that creates sovereignty can create suffering, that the same practice that liberates you can devastate others. The Stoics knew this. They taught strategic silence as a form of self-mastery, but they also recognized its capacity for cruelty, for manipulation, for psychological torture, because silence deployed without wisdom, silence used to punish rather than to protect sovereignty, silence weaponized to inflict suffering rather than to maintain boundaries, is one of the most psychologically damaging things one human can do to another. This is the paradox at the heart of this practice. The same silence that creates freedom can create prison. The same withdrawal that demonstrates sovereignty can demonstrate contempt. The same non-reaction that reveals strength can reveal cruelty. The difference is intention, context, wisdom, and most people lack the discrimination to know when silence serves virtue and when it serves ego's desire to punish. Consider what happens psychologically when someone is met with unexpected silence. You speak, you expect response. Response doesn't come. Immediately, your mind begins generating explanations. Did they not hear me? Are they thinking about what I said? Are they angry, disappointed, judging me? Did I say something wrong? The uncertainty triggers anxiety. Your threat detection system activates because the absence of clear social signal registers as potential danger. In evolutionary terms, being Being ignored by the group was often a precursor to exile, and exile meant death. So your brain is hardwired to experience social silence as threat. Your heart rate increases. Your stress hormones elevate. Your attention fixates on the silent person, trying to read micro expressions, trying to find any signal that resolves the uncertainty. And the longer the silence continues, the more intense this reaction becomes. This is not conscious. This is automatic physiological response to perceived social threat, and someone who understands this mechanism can exploit it ruthlessly. By simply maintaining silence, they keep you in a state of elevated stress. They make you work to interpret their internal state. They force you to fill the void with imagination, which almost always imagines judgment and rejection. They trigger your insecurity without saying a word. This is psychological manipulation at its most elegant, because they're not doing anything, they're just not responding. They can claim complete innocence. I was just quiet. You're the one who created all those stories about what my silence meant. But the manipulation is real. The suffering is real. The controls is real. They've activated your threat response and are maintaining that activation through strategic non-response. This is the dark side of silence, the recognition that withholding social response is not neutral, it's active. It creates specific psychological effects, and those effects can be deliberately cultivated to control others' emotional states and behavior. The Stoics understood this darkness, and they taught silence anyway, not because they were cruel, but because they recognized that understanding the mechanism is necessary to avoid being controlled by it. Because here's the deeper layer. Most people are already being controlled through this mechanism, not by Stoic philosophers, but by anyone who understands that silence creates leverage. Consider the silent treatment in relationships. One person withdraws communication as punishment for some perceived transgression. They don't explain what's wrong, don't express their needs, don't engage in problem solving. They just go silent. And the other person, desperate to resolve the uncertainty, to restore connection, to eliminate the threat signal, becomes increasingly anxious, increasingly willing to apologize for things they didn't do, increasingly desperate to say or do whatever might end the silence. This is control. This is manipulation. This is the deliberate activation of another person's attachment, fear, and uncertainty intolerance to extract compliance. And it works devastatingly well, because humans are wired to seek resolution to social uncertainty. We need to know where we stand, need to know if we're safe in the relationship, need to restore connection when it's threatened, and someone who withholds connection, who maintains silence, who refuses to resolve uncertainty, has enormous power over someone who needs these things. This is psychological torture, not metaphorically, literally. Isolation and social exclusion activate the same neural networks as physical pain. The suffering is real. The brain cannot distinguish between social pain and physical pain at a neurological level. So maintaining prolonged silence, especially in close relationships, is inflicting genuine suffering. And when that silence is strategic, when it's deployed deliberately to punish or control, it crosses from boundary setting into abuse. The Stoics recognized this distinction. They practiced silence as self-protection, as sovereignty, as the refusal to be manipulated through provocation. But they condemned silence as punishment, as withdrawal of basic human recognition, as the deliberate infliction of social pain to control behavior. Pt. Tunvudridendine, Epictetus taught that you should treat all humans with basic dignity regardless of their behavior toward you. That your virtue requires responding to others as rational beings deserving of recognition, even when you're setting boundaries against their manipulation attempts. This means you can refuse to engage with manipulative behavior without refusing to acknowledge the person's existence. You can set boundaries without inflicting social pain. You can maintain sovereignty without weaponizing silence. The discrimination is crucial, and most people collapse these distinctions. They believe that boundary setting requires punishment, that protecting themselves requires inflicting pain. That silence is binary. Either you engage with manipulation or you disappear completely. But there's a middle path, the Stoic path, where you remain present but unmanipulable, where you acknowledge others as humans while refusing to participate in unhealthy dynamics, where you maintain basic respect while setting absolute boundaries. This path requires more sophistication than either total engagement or total withdrawal. It requires the ability to say, I see you trying to manipulate me, and I'm not participating, without saying it as punishment. To communicate, your behavior is not acceptable, and I won't tolerate it, without withdrawing basic human recognition. To maintain, I'm sovereign in my responses, and I choose not to react to this, while still treating the other person with fundamental dignity. This distinction matters because it's the difference between Stoic silence and dark psychology silence. Stoic silence protects sovereignty while maintaining virtue. Dark psychology silence weaponizes others' attachment, needs to inflict suffering, and extract control. The first is liberation, the second is abuse, and the line between them is intention. Are you silent to protect your peace, or to punish another? Are you withholding response because reaction would compromise your principles, or because you want them to suffer for disappointing you? Are you maintaining boundaries, or inflicting consequences? These questions require brutal self-honesty, because it's very easy to dress revenge in the language of boundaries, to call punishment self-protection, to frame cruelty as sovereignty. Your ego will lie to you about this, will convince you that you're being principled when you're actually being vindictive, that you're protecting yourself when you're actually retaliating, that you're practicing stoicism when you're actually practicing manipulation. The way to know the difference is to examine what you want from the silence. If you want nothing, if you're genuinely at peace with or without their response, genuinely indifferent to whether they understand or approve, genuinely content to simply maintain your boundary regardless of outcome, that's Stoic silence. If you want them to suffer, to feel anxious, to come begging, to understand how much they hurt you, to experience consequences for their behavior, that's dark psychology silence. One is freedom, one is bondage disguised as freedom. Because when you use silence to punish, you're still controlled by the dynamic. You're still making your peace contingent on their suffering. You're still invested in their response, just seeking a different response than before. You haven't achieved sovereignty. You've just changed tactics within the same power struggle. This is a trap most people fall into. They learn about strategic silence. They recognize its power, and they immediately deploy it as a weapon in existing conflicts. They use it to make others feel what they've felt, to inflict the uncertainty and anxiety they've experienced, to give them a taste of their own medicine, and they call this Stoicism, but it's not. It's revenge. And revenge is the opposite of Stoic practice, because revenge requires you to be invested in the other person's suffering, requires you to make your peace dependent on their pain, requires you to stay engaged with the dynamic at the deepest level, the level of needing them to feel consequences for harming you. The Stoic position is complete release of this need, not because you're endorsing their behavior, not because you're saying it's okay, but because you're recognizing that their behavior is their responsibility and their consequence, not yours to manage. Your responsibility is your response, your virtue, your character, and virtue doesn't require anyone else to suffer, doesn't need revenge, doesn't depend on others learning lessons. Virtue is sufficient unto itself. This is the hardest teaching to internalize, because it feels deeply unjust. They harmed you. They should face consequences. They should understand what they've done. They should suffer as you suffered. These feelings are natural, human, understandable, and completely irrelevant to your practice, because your practice is about your freedom, not their punishment, about your sovereignty, not their suffering, about your peace, not their pain. The moment you make your peace contingent on their suffering, you've surrendered your sovereignty. You've placed your well-being outside yourself again, just in a different location. Before, your peace depended on their approval. Now it depends on their pain. But either way, you're not free. You're still controlled by them, still making them the center of your emotional world, still granting them power over your internal state. The Stoic liberation is releasing all of this, not needing their approval, not needing their suffering, not needing anything from them at all, just living according to your principles and being genuinely indifferent to their response. This indifference is not cruelty, it's freedom. It's the recognition that they're responsible for their choices, and you're responsible for yours, and your choices don't require their approval or their consequences to be valid. This is the light side of silence, the use of non-reaction to maintain sovereignty without inflicting suffering. But the dark side exists, and we must look at it directly, because there are people who use silence as a weapon, who understand the psychology perfectly and deploy it to control and harm. This is not Stoicism, this is manipulation, but it uses uses the same mechanism, so you need to understand what it looks like, what it feels like. E. How to recognize when you're experiencing it, and how to recognize if you're doing it. Dark psychology silence has specific characteristics. First, it's inconsistent. It's not a stable boundary. It's withdrawn and restored based on compliance. When you do what they want, they're communicative. When you don't, they disappear. This conditions you like a lab animal. You learn that connection is contingent on obedience. That communication is a reward for compliance. That you must earn their engagement through submission. This is operant conditioning, and it's devastatingly effective because humans need connection, need communication, need to know where they stand. And someone who makes these things contingent on your behavior has enormous power to shape that behavior. Second, dark psychology silence is ambiguous. They never clearly state that they're upset or why. They just withdraw. This keeps you in maximum uncertainty. You don't know what you did wrong, don't know how to fix it, don't know if they're angry or just busy, don't know if this is about you or about something else. The ambiguity is deliberate because ambiguity triggers anxiety, and anxiety makes you compliant, makes you eager to please, makes you willing to apologize for things you didn't do just to resolve the uncertainty. The manipulation is in maintaining maximum ambiguity while appearing to do nothing. They're just quiet, but the quiet is calculated to create maximum psychological discomfort. Third, dark psychology silence is prolonged beyond any reasonable boundary setting purpose. If you're setting a boundary, you communicate the boundary and maintain it. I don't engage with this behavior. When you're ready to communicate respectfully, I'm available. Until then, I'm unavailable for this dynamic. That's a boundary. It's clear. It's time, limited by the other person's behavior change. It doesn't create unnecessary suffering. Dark psychology silence has no clear end condition. It just continues for days, weeks, sometimes months. The person knows you're suffering, knows you're desperate to resolve things, and maintains the silence anyway, not to protect themselves, but to punish you, to make you feel the maximum consequences for whatever they perceived you did wrong, to train you never to do it again through the infliction of prolonged social pain. This is abuse. Clear and unambiguous. It's the deliberate infliction of suffering to control behavior, and it's remarkably common in relationships, in families, in workplaces, in social groups. People who've discovered that silence is a powerful weapon and who deploy it without ethical restraint. The Stoics would recognize this as the opposite of virtue, as the use of power to harm rather than to maintain integrity, as the prioritization of control over character, and they would condemn it absolutely, not because silence is wrong, but because the intention behind this silence is wrong. The purpose is harm, and no harm to another is consistent with living according to virtue. So how do you recognize if you're on the receiving end of this, of pleti to windine? How do you distinguish between someone setting healthy boundaries through silence and someone weaponizing silence to control you? Look at these markers. First, healthy silence includes communication about the boundary. They tell you why they're not engaging, what behavior is problematic, what would need to change for engagement to resume. They're clear, they're specific, they're setting a boundary, not playing a power game. Manipulative silence is non-explanatory. They just disappear without clarity. Second, healthy silence is consistent. The boundary remains regardless of whether you're suffering or begging or apologizing. It's not about punishing you, it's about protecting them. So it doesn't shift based on your distress. Manipulative silence is variable. It increases when you show distress. They're monitoring your suffering and calibrating the silence to maximize it. Third, healthy silence doesn't require you to guess. They've told you the issue. You know what the problem is. You know what would need to change. You might not like it, but you're not in the dark. Manipulative silence keeps you guessing, keeps you in uncertainty about what you did wrong, whether they're upset, what would fix things. The uncertainty is the point. Fourth, healthy silence doesn't escalate. If you respect the boundary and stop engaging, they don't increase the silent treatment. They maintain the boundary until their condition is met, then re-engage. Manipulative silence escalates if you're not suffering enough. If you appear to be okay with their absence, they find ways to make their absence more painful. They recruit others. They create social consequences. They ensure you cannot escape the message that you're being punished. These distinctions matter, because if you're experiencing manipulative silence, the Stoic response is not to play the game, not to chase, not to beg, not to apologize without understanding. The response is to recognize manipulation and refuse to be manipulated. This might mean accepting the relationship is over, might mean walking away from someone who's trying to control you, might mean tolerating their continued silence without it affecting your peace. This is hard, because there's often history, often love, often investment, often hope that they'll stop playing games and communicate honestly. But here's the truth the Stoics understood. You cannot have a genuine relationship with someone someone who relates to you through manipulation. You cannot build intimacy with someone who weaponizes connection. You cannot trust someone who inflicts suffering to control your behavior. And trying to maintain these relationships requires you to surrender your sovereignty, to accept being controlled, to live in constant anxiety about whether you're going to trigger another withdrawal of communication. This is no way to live. This is captivity disguised as relationship, and the Stoic path is recognizing this clearly and making choices based on reality rather than hope. If someone is manipulating you through silence, no amount of compliance will create genuine connection. It will only train them that manipulation works, that they can control you through this mechanism. That withdrawing communication is an effective way to get what they want, and they will continue using it, probably increasingly, because it's working. The only response that serves your sovereignty is to refuse to be controlled by it, to remain at peace, whether they're communicating or not. Bleachy 2:19. To make decisions based on their actual behavior, rather than your hopes about their potential behavior. To accept that this is who they are and to choose accordingly. This acceptance is brutal, because it often means grieving the relationship you wanted with them, but will never have. Grieving the person you believe they were, but they aren't. Grieving the future you imagined that won't materialize. This grief is real and necessary, but on the other side of it is freedom. Freedom from being controlled. Freedom from living in constant anxiety. Freedom from making your peace contingent on someone else's moods and manipulations. This freedom is worth the grief, always, because captivity, no matter how familiar, no matter how much history it has, no matter how much you've invested in it, is still captivity, and you deserve freedom, not eventually, not if they change, not if you just try harder to please them. Now, as you are, regardless of whether they approve, this is the Stoic teaching, that your well-being is not contingent on anyone else's behavior, that you can be at peace regardless of whether others are communicating with you, that you're complete in yourself, sufficient in your principles, free in your sovereignty, 19. And anyone who tries to control you through psychological manipulation is revealing that they're not safe for genuine connection. Now let's examine the other possibility, that you're the one deploying dark psychology silence, that you're using non-communication to punish, to control, to make someone suffer for hurting or disappointing you. This is harder to recognize in yourself because your mind will rationalize it, will tell you they deserve it, that you're just protecting yourself, that they need to understand the consequences of their actions, that you're setting boundaries. But examine this honestly. Are you at peace with the silence? Or are you monitoring whether they're suffering enough? Are you genuinely indifferent to their response? Or are you hoping they're anxious, desperate, remorseful? Are you maintaining a principle? Or are you inflicting a punishment? If you're honest, you'll know. And if the answer is that you're punishing, you need to stop. Not because they don't deserve consequences, but because using silence as a weapon destroys your own character, compromises your own virtue, makes you a manipulator, and manipulation is incompatible with the life you're trying to build. The Stoic alternative is clear communication followed by clear boundaries. If someone has harmed you, tell them. Specifically, this behavior is not acceptable to me. It violates my boundaries. I need it to stop. That's communication. Then maintain the boundary. If this behavior continues, I will not be available for this relationship in this form. I'll need to create distance until the pattern changes. That's a boundary. Then follow through. If the behavior continues, create the distance you stated, not as punishment, as protection. You're protecting your peace, your sovereignty, your well-being, and you're doing it clearly. They know where they stand. They know what the issue is. They know what would need to change. There's no ambiguity, no mind games, no psychological torture, just clear consequence for clear behavior. This is how adults handle boundaries, with clarity and consistency, not with sulking and withdrawal and making others guess what's wrong while you punish them for failing to read your mind. That's adolescent behavior, and if you're practicing it, you're not practicing Stoicism. You're practicing manipulation. The path out is simple but not easy. Commit to clear communication. When you're upset, say so. When someone's behavior is unacceptable, name it. When you need distance, explain why and for how long. Take all the ambiguity out. Stop making people guess. Stop using your silence as a weapon. Stop inflicting uncertainty as punishment. Just be clear, be direct, be honest. This feels vulnerable because clarity reveals you, shows what you want, shows what hurt you, shows what matters to you. And all of that can be used against you by someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart. But that's the point. If you can't be clear with someone because they'll weaponize your honesty, you shouldn't be in relationship with them at all. The solution isn't to become manipulative yourself. It's to recognize that this relationship is unsafe and to create distance from it. Not through silent withdrawal, through clear communication of your decision. This relationship relationship isn't working for me. I'm choosing to step back. Then do it. Without drama, without punishment, without silent treatment. Just clear decision and clear follow through. This is Stoic practice. Living according to your principles. Communicating clearly. Setting boundaries respectfully. Following through consistently. And being at peace with others. Responses to your boundaries. Because some people will not respond well. Will be angry. Will call you names. Will try to manipulate you back into the dynamic. And you remain unmoved. Not because you're punishing them, but because you're maintaining your integrity. Your silence, if it occurs, is not weaponized absence. It's simply the natural consequence of them having nothing productive to say, and you having no obligation to engage with unproductive communication. You're available for respectful conversation. You're unavailable for manipulation, abuse, or continued boundary violations. This is clear. This is clean. This is stoic. And it creates none of the psychological suffering that dark psychology silence creates. Because you've removed the ambiguity. You've communicated your position. You've set your boundary. And you're maintaining it without game, playing, or punishment. The relationship might end. That's a possible outcome. But it ends clearly, with both parties knowing exactly why. With no one left in tortured uncertainty about what happened or what they did wrong or whether reconciliation is possible. This clarity is kind, even when it's difficult. Even when the message is, I can't do this anymore. Clarity is always kinder than ambiguous withdrawal. Always more respectful than silent punishment. Always more virtuous than manipulative absence. So if you're going to practice silence, practice it this way. With communication first, with boundaries clearly stated, with ambiguity removed, with your intention being protection of your sovereignty, not infliction of suffering. This is the light side of silence, the virtuous application of a powerful tool. But we must also acknowledge the other layer of darkness and silence, the way it operates in systems of power, because individual relationships are one context, but silence has been weaponized at a societal level throughout history, and understanding this helps you recognize when you're experiencing systemic manipulation versus individual boundary setting. Consider how authoritarian systems use silence. They don't respond to criticism, don't acknowledge dissent, don't engage with questions. They simply proceed as if opposition doesn't exist. This creates a specific psychological effect in the population. People begin to doubt whether their concerns are valid, begin to wonder if they're the only ones who see problems, begin to feel isolated in their opposition, because the system's silence suggests that their concerns don't even merit response, that they're so insignificant they can be safely ignored. This is gaslighting at a societal scale. The system's refusal to acknowledge legitimate concerns makes people doubt their own perception, makes them feel crazy for caring about things the system treats as beneath notice, makes them feel alone because the silence suggests no one else shares their concerns. And isolated people are easier to control than connected people. 219. People who doubt their own perception are easier to manipulate than people confident in their reality. So systemic silence serves power by fragmenting opposition, by making each dissenter feel like they're alone, by suggesting that concerns don't merit acknowledgement. This is why authoritarian systems so often respond to protest with silence rather than suppression. Suppression acknowledges the protest as significant enough to warrant response. Silence treats it as insignificant, as not even worth addressing. And this psychological dismissal is often more demoralizing than active suppression, because it suggests that you don't matter, that your concerns don't matter, that your voice is so irrelevant it can be safely ignored. This attacks the fundamental human need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. And that attack is often more psychologically devastating than direct confrontation. The Stoics would recognize this as a manipulation tactic, as the use of silence to control and demoralize rather than to maintain integrity. And they would counsel against falling for it, against allowing systemic silence to make you doubt your perception or feel isolated in your concerns, because the silence is strategic. It's designed to create these effects, and you can refuse to experience them by recognizing the mechanism. By understanding that silence doesn't mean your concerns are invalid. It means the system has decided that acknowledging them would be disadvantageous, that engaging would give them legitimacy, that responding would suggest they merit consideration. So the system stays silent, not because you're wrong, but because acknowledging you're right would be costly. This reframe changes everything. D. Instead of internalizing the silence as evidence of your insignificance, you can recognize it as evidence of the system's fear. Fear that engaging honestly would expose problems it doesn't want to address. Fear that acknowledging concerns would validate them. Fear that responding would require either admission of error or obvious dismissal, both of which would be be costly. So it stays silent and hopes you'll interpret the silence as evidence of your own irrelevance. But once you see the mechanism, the manipulation fails. You recognize that systemic silence is strategy, not truth, that it reveals the system's vulnerability, not your insignificance, that it demonstrates their need to avoid the conversation, not the conversation's lack of merit. This recognition is immunization against the psychological effects of systemic silence. You can observe the silence without internalizing its implied message, can recognize it as a manipulation tactic without being manipulated by it, can maintain your perception and your confidence despite the system's refusal to engage. This is Stoic practice at a societal level, maintaining your internal reality regardless of external acknowledgement. Knowing Tiger and knowing your concerns are valid regardless of whether anyone responds to them. Being confident in your perception regardless of whether it's affirmed by authority. This sovereignty is what systemic silence tries to destroy, and it's what Stoic practice preserves, not through fighting for acknowledgement, but through being unshaken in its absence, through recognizing that your reality doesn't require validation. Wine team, that your concerns don't require response to be legitimate, that you don't need the system to engage with you to know that you're right. This is the final layer of the dark psychology of silence, that it's used not just interpersonally, but systemically, not just by individuals to control others, but by institutions to control populations. And in both contexts, the Stoic response is the same. Recognize the mechanism, refuse to be manipulated by it, and maintain your sovereignty regardless of whether your voice is acknowledged. This creates an interesting paradox. The Stoics teach strategic silence as a tool of sovereignty, but they also teach resistance to others' strategic silence when it's used to manipulate. How do you hold both? How do you practice silence without weaponizing it? How do you resist others' silence without becoming a person who demands constant response? The answer is in intention and wisdom. You practice silence to protect your sovereignty, to maintain your boundaries, to refuse participation in unhealthy dynamics. You do it with clear communication of your boundaries, with respect for others' humanity, even as you refuse their behavior, with genuine indifference to outcome rather than desire to punish. And you resist others' silence when it's designed to manipulate, when it's ambiguous and prolonged and escalating, when it's clearly aimed at making you suffer rather than protecting their peace, when it violates basic respect and human dignity. You distinguish between boundary setting silence and weaponized silence by examining the characteristics we've discussed, and you respond accordingly. To boundary setting silence, you respond with respect. You honor the boundary. You stop engaging. You give them the space they've asked for. You don't chase or beg or violate the boundary, even if it hurts, even if you want to resolve things. You respect that they've set a limit and you honor it. This is maturity. This is virtue. This is treating others as you'd want to be treated. To weaponized silence, you respond with sovereignty. You recognize the manipulation. You refuse to be controlled by it. You stop chasing. You stop suffering in uncertainty. You make decisions based on their behavior rather than your hopes. You accept that someone using dark psychology tactics is not safe for genuine connection. You create distance. You protect yourself. You move forward with your life without waiting for them to decide you've suffered enough. This is also maturity. This is also virtue. This is protecting yourself from abuse while maintaining your own character. The line between these responses is the line between respecting boundaries and allowing abuse. And you walk that line through constant examination of what's actually happening versus what you hope is happening, through honest assessment of whether someone is protecting themselves or punishing you, through willingness to see manipulation clearly, even when you love the manipulator, through commitment to your own sovereignty regardless of cost. This is Stoic practice in the realm of silence, using it to protect yourself, refusing to weaponize it against others, recognizing when others are weaponizing it against you, maintaining your virtue throughout. This is possible, but it requires the discrimination we've been developing, the ability to see darkness clearly, to name manipulation honestly, to recognize your own capacity for cruelty and choose differently, to understand of PT the psychology deeply enough that you can't be unconsciously controlled by it. This is why we're examining the dark psychology, not to teach you how to manipulate, but to make you immune to manipulation, not to turn you into someone who weaponizes silence, but to help you recognize when it's being weaponized against you, not to make you paranoid, but to make you clear-sighted. Because the truth is that these mechanisms are operating constantly, in relationships, in workplaces, in social dynamics, in political systems, in media environments. Silence is being used strategically everywhere, sometimes virtuously, sometimes manipulatively, and if you can't can't tell the difference, you're vulnerable. You'll be controlled by others' silence when you should be respecting it. You'll be manipulated through ambiguity when you should be walking away. You'll weaponize your own silence when you think you're setting boundaries. The darkness exists. The manipulation is real, and pretending it's not there doesn't protect you from it. It just makes you an easier target. So we look at it, we examine it, we understand exactly how silence operates psychologically, what fears it triggers, what needs it exploits, what effects it creates, and in understanding it completely, we become immune to being unconsciously controlled by it. This is the point. This is the purpose of examining darkness, not to become dark, but to see clearly enough that darkness can't operate in shadow anymore. The Stoics were masters of this. They looked at human psychology without flinching, examined manipulation without euphemism, studied power without naivety, and in doing so, they became unmanipulable, not because they were cynical, but because they were clear. They saw how humans operate, how fear works, how control functions, how power maintains itself, and they used that knowledge to live virtuously in corrupt systems, to maintain integrity in manipulative environments, to preserve sovereignty in contexts designed to eliminate it. They didn't close their eyes to darkness. They studied it until they understood it completely, and then they chose light anyway. This is the model. This is the path. Not willful ignorance of how manipulation works, N-team, but complete understanding of manipulation, combined with complete commitment to never using that understanding for manipulation yourself. This is wisdom. This is virtue. This is Stoic practice at its highest level. You understand the dark psychology. You see how silence can be weaponized. You recognize your own capacity for cruelty, and you choose, deliberately and consistently, to use your understanding to protect sovereignty and respect others' humanity, rather than to control and harm. This choice is available in every moment. Every time you're upset with someone, every time you want to punish, every time you're tempted to withdraw without explanation to make them suffer, every time you feel that urge to use your silence as a weapon, that's when the choice point arrives. And in that moment, you can ask, am I protecting my sovereignty? Or am I trying to hurt them? Am I setting a boundary? Or am I playing a power game? Am I being virtuous? Or am I being manipulative? These questions cut through the rationalization, cut through the ego's justifications, cut through the revenge fantasies dressed as principles, and they reveal the truth about your intention, about your character, about whether you're actually practicing Stoicism or just using its language to justify behavior you know is wrong. This honesty is brutal, because often, if you're honest, you'll see that you're not being virtuous, you're being vindictive, you're not protecting yourself, you're retaliating, you're not maintaining boundaries, you're playing power games, and seeing this clearly is uncomfortable, is ego-destroying, is humbling in the extreme, but it's necessary, because you cannot change what you won't see, cannot improve what you won't acknowledge, cannot become virtuous while pretending your manipulation is wisdom. So you look, you see yourself clearly, you acknowledge when you're being manipulative, when you're weaponizing silence, when you're inflicting suffering under the guise of boundaries, and you stop. You apologize if appropriate. You communicate clearly what you should have communicated before. You change your behavior going forward. You use the recognition as a teacher rather than a reason for self-condemnation, because self-condemnation is just another ego game, another way to avoid actually changing. The Stoic move is to see clearly, acknowledge honestly, and change immediately, without drama, without self-flagellation, without elaborate justification or explanation. You were wrong. Now you'll do differently. That's it. This is how adults handle recognizing their own manipulation, not by defending it, not by explaining why they had reasons, not by making themselves the victim of their own behavior, but by owning it, stopping it, and doing better. This is character development. This is virtue in action. This is the moment-by-moment practice of becoming someone whose silence protects rather than punishes, who uses power to maintain integrity rather than to control others, who understands dark psychology well enough to never practice it. This is possible for you right now, in your actual relationships, in your real conflicts, in the moments when you're hurt and angry and tempted to withdraw into punishing silence. You can choose differently, can choose clarity over ambiguity, can choose communication over withdrawal, can choose boundaries over punishment, can choose sovereignty over revenge. This choice is always available, always, no matter how justified your anger, no matter how hurt you are, no matter how much you believe they deserve to suffer. You can still choose to be virtuous, to be clear, to be someone who maintains character, even when others don't, even when they've wronged you, even when they probably wouldn't extend the same courtesy to you. You can still choose virtue, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve it, because you deserve to be someone who lives according to principles. Dunning, who doesn't compromise character for revenge, who doesn't sacrifice integrity for the satisfaction of watching someone suffer. You deserve this, and it's available available through the simple, but brutally difficult practice of examining your intentions honestly and choosing virtue, even when vice would feel satisfying. This is the teaching. This is the path through the darkness. Not around it, not pretending it doesn't exist, but through it, by looking at it directly, by understanding it completely, by recognizing it in yourself and others, by developing the wisdom to distinguish between virtuous and manipulative applications of the same tool, by committing absolutely to using your understanding for protection and sovereignty rather than for control and harm. This commitment is what makes you stoic rather than just psychologically informed, because lots of people understand these mechanisms, understand how silence manipulates, understand how to weaponize uncertainty, understand the dark psychology perfectly, and they use it to control others, to maintain power, to punish those who disappoint them, to get what they want through psychological torture. This is not wisdom. This is knowledge in service of vice. The Stoic difference is that you understand equally, well, maybe better, but you refuse to use that understanding for manipulation. You use it only to protect yourself from manipulation and to ensure your own silence remains virtuous. This refusal is everything. This is what makes you trustworthy, what makes your silence something others can respect rather than fear, what makes your boundaries clear rather than manipulative, what makes you someone safe for genuine connection rather than someone who must be carefully managed. 2. Avoid triggering withdrawals of communication. This is who you're becoming through this practice. Someone who understands power and refuses to abuse it. Someone who recognizes manipulation and declines to practice it. Someone who sees the darkness clearly and chooses light anyway. This is Stoic character. This is virtue. This is the life worth living. And it's available not through ignorance of darkness, but through complete understanding of it, combined with complete commitment to never embodying it. This is the paradox. You must understand the dark psychology to avoid being controlled by it, must see how silence weaponizes, must recognize manipulation in all its forms. But you must understand it all in service of virtue, rather than in service of power over others. This is the razor's edge. This is where wisdom lies, in the space between naivety and manipulation, between being controlled and being controlling, between ignorance and cruelty. In that space, you understand completely and act virtuously. You see everything and harm no one. You recognize all the mechanisms and use none of them against others. This is mastery. This is freedom. This is what the Stoics practiced and what they're inviting you to practice. The complete understanding of darkness in service of living in light. If this revealed something you needed to see, follow for more uncomfortable clarity and share what you recognized in yourself below. No judgment, just truth.